Have sex, excel. Put my hands against, put my best, put my 10, or put my spend. Have sex, excel. Aftermath fully crack show. Vola. Tingani tandi best show. Vola. Tandi dashi tandi hair show. Vola.
When do I know I'm Spider-Man?
You won't. That's all it is, Miles. A leap of faith.
Like, what's up, danger? Like, what's up, danger?
When you adapt something into a movie, you need to hire the right people for the job. It is up to the producer to decide who is going to direct it and who is going to write the movie, which is why it's very important to have ambition for such a project, and to understand the source material as well. Today I'm going to talk about the film producer and businessman, AVI ARAD, who is known for adapting such Marvel characters into movies and TV shows, mostly animation, and for being the head of the toy company, Toy Biz. ARAD is a very influential businessman who knows how to get what he wants. ARAD can give life to something big. However, like many greedy businessmen, he can also be the cause of its downfall. Today, I'm going to talk about the ways that AVI ARAD can ruin a movie. And also, I warn you about the incoming of spoilers. As I mentioned before, when you adapt something into a movie, you need an ambition. And unfortunately, ARAD has no ambition. The only thing he has in mind is how he can make a profit. Look at the first Daredevil, for instance. The movie didn't go anywhere. He just made it to capitalize on the success of the previous Marvel movies at the time, such as the X-Men and the Spider-Man. And the same goes to the movies that came after, such as the first Punisher, Elektra, the first Fantastic Four, and even the Ghost Rider. Although I gotta admit, the movie was a guilty pleasure, but still, I hate to see such a potential being wasted like that. And all for the sake of toy sales. And that's why he makes these movies the way he does, just to sell toys. And it's not only Marvel movies. He is also responsible for the failure of the Ghost in the Shell, as well as Borderlands and Uncharted. I mean, just by seeing his name on the credits is enough reason for a movie to fail. But of course there are exceptions. As I mentioned before, ARAD is a very influential businessman. When the first Marvel projects came to life in the 90s, he was responsible for financing these projects. And that's all he can do. He's good to finance something. When you see his name on the credits as an executive producer, then chances are the movie might succeed. But if you see him receiving the credit as a main producer, the chances for the movie to succeed are very small. Such was the case with X-Men: The Last Stand. On the first two movies, ARAD was working only as an executive producer. And once he stepped in the third movie as a main producer, it resulted in a story with too many characters filling a very limited runtime. But there are also exceptions. As I spoke before, you must hire the right people for the job. And while ARAD can secure the finances of a movie, he cannot produce it. He needs someone else to work with him as a producer. That's why the first Iron Man became what we know and love, because Kevin Feige was there. Because Feige knew exactly what to do. Because he had an ambition. Something ARAD will never be able to have. And the same thing goes to The Incredible Hulk. At least until Disney came along and told him to tone down.
Him? Jesus, that's him.
It's Blade. It's the Daywalker.
When the first Blade came out, it changed everything. It gave the confidence the other studios needed to make more superhero movies. With ARAD only working as executive producer. And after seeing how much money the first Spider-Man made, that ARAD has decided to step in the sequel as a main producer. But hear me out. There was one person that made a big difference for Spider-Man at the time, and her name was Laura Ziskin. She worked as a producer for the first Spider-Man, and then she worked in the sequel, this time with ARAD. And then she worked in Spider-Man 3, also with ARAD. But this time, because of him, because he forced Sam Raimi to include Venom, that the movie was completely destroyed. But then, a couple of years later, the franchise was rebooted with The Amazing Spider-Man, with Laura Ziskin and Avi Arad returning as producers. But here's the sad thing. In 2011, during the production of the movie, Laura Ziskin died of cancer. And without her, Arad could run the franchise. Now, having more control, he could make a few calls on his own. But even before that, he was already causing enough damage for the movie by adding the lizard on the story. But don't get me wrong, I think the character was really well developed, and very convincing too, considering all the CGI involved. But still, it was a really bad decision, considering the movie wanted to make a Batman Begins approach, with a grittier and more grounded tone. And by adding the lizard, this approach was completely tossed away. I mean, I love how Mark Webb handled the movie, using as much practical effects as he could. So much that it made the feeling of being Spider-Man look more real, something that have been missing a lot in the MCU. But again, adding a completely surrealistic villain goes against everything the movie was trying to do. And not to mention the whole story arc involving Peter's parents that was completely shoehorned, because they wanted to retell the origin story by killing Uncle Ben again, and then introduce the lizard, and the movie basically went nowhere. But then they decided to bring back the whole mystery behind Peter's parents on the post-credit scene for the sake of sequel baiting. I mean, it could have been a lot better if the whole story was about Peter's parents. Although it was cool to have Peter chasing down the guy who killed Uncle Ben. But then it was overshadowed by the whole lizard story. It was one story that was overshadowed by another story that was overshadowed by another story. And because of all these twists and turns, the movie went nowhere. And then came The Amazing Spider-Man 2. This time, without Lauren Ziskin. This time, Avi Arad was completely in charge of the movie. He could do basically whatever he wanted, even if that meant making same mistakes he made with Spider-Man 3. I mean, he had no idea what he was doing, as evident by the countless deleted scenes that could have made a big difference. He was just trying to replicate the MCU formula by trying to extend the universe, by teasing more sequels and spin-offs. But in the end, they never came. Once again, the movie went nowhere. And the marketing was very misleading. It basically lied to us. First, there was the Rhino, who was marketed as one of the main villains, but he was only introduced in the end. And then, the trailer tried to tell us that the story was going to be about Peter's parents, that secrets would be revealed. But almost nothing was revealed. The movie was so overloaded of subplots that they overshadowed what was supposed to be the main plot. Once again, letting that to be concluded only in the sequel. But once again, I want to highlight Mark Webb's approach. Without him, this movie would have been nothing. Really. All he was trying to do was to make the movie more enjoyable. People should not blame him for the failure of this franchise.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Greed is for amateurs.
Greed is right. Greed works.
When the first Venom was announced, I was already skeptical, mostly for seeing that Arad was also involved, and for knowing that Sony wanted to try again with another cinematic universe. And even though the movie had some entertainment value, it was severely held back by the limitations of the PG-13 rating, and wasted any potential with a thin story inconsistent tone, and empty promises. And then came Let There Be Carnage, which chooses to underestimate the audience even more by delivering a limited story, juvenile tone, and more empty promises. They even abandoned their original plan of making a contained cinematic universe in order to use the multiverse to exploit the MCU. But it was Morbius that really took a toll on them, caused by its misleading marketing, cheap writing, and even more empty promises. But Into the Spider-Verse, on the other hand, was made under different conditions, because Phil Lord and Chris Miller had real passion for the project. So much that they gave us something completely new and unique. And while AVI ARAD was there, Phil Lord and Chris Miller were the ones with actual control over the movie. And they got an Oscar for this. And that makes me wonder if this too could be the solution for Sony's live-action Marvel movies. Because one of Arad's many weaknesses is that he's too afraid to take risks. When he is in charge, he wants to play safe. He wants a PG-13 rating. He wants famous actors just because they're famous, and a simple story that can end up being shallow, which can also be caused by an equally shallow choice of screenwriters. The first Daredevil was made by one of the writers from the 1998's Jack Frost. The Amazing Spiderman 2 had some of the writers from the first Transformers. Ghost in the Shell also have one writer from many Transformers. All three Venom movies were made by the same writer from 50 Shades of Grey. Morbius was made by the same writers from Gods of Egypt, and Kraven the Hunter was made by the same writers from Transformers: The Last Night. And just so you can have an idea of how the right producers can make a difference, the first Spider-Man was made by the same writer from the first Jurassic Park. Spider-Man 2 had an Oscar-winning writer from the 1977's Julia and the 1980's Ordinary People. And in The Amazing Spider-Man, despite the problems caused by AVI ARAD, it had a very solid screenplay, which was not only made by Alvin Sargent, but also made by the writer from the Harry Potter saga and the writer from the Zodiac. Just to clarify, this breakdown is my interpretation. People can have different thoughts on different things. And from the way I see, his movies fail because he doesn't take risks, because of bad writers, and it can either add too many characters or pick up the wrong ones. So how can you know if a movie is gonna fail? For that, you need to look in the credits and see if Arad is one of the main producers, and find out who the writers are. And how can you know if a movie might succeed? For that, you need to see whether if Arad is an executive producer or who else is producing the movie with him. Such was the case with Kevin Feige, Laura Ziskin, and Phil Lord and Chris Miller. Unfortunately, despite everything, Arad has no signs of slowing down. He still wants to adapt more Marvel movies for Sony, as well as more anime and video game movies.